If you're investing in anything, I mean, at a certain point, you start taking a look at, well, how does it react in relation to other investments? For example, stocks, bonds, those kind of things. How do they work together? How do they act in different environments? Obviously, the old rule is stocks and bonds are supposed to move inversely, right? Things like that. Now with gold, what's the inverse for gold? Well, typically people look at how's the dollar doing. And if you've been watching the dollar's been getting hammered. So that being the case, what does that mean for gold in the short run? Does that mean that gold is going to keep going up? Does it mean that it's, at the peak, so to speak? It's hard to say, but any asset, I would say, when you look at things, typically whenever you see something, get really, really hit, it has a bounce. That's normal. That's actually very normal, regardless of what the asset is. I mean, that stock market kind of behaves in that manner. Lots of different assets behave in that manner, where they'll have a big run up and then, it's normal that they have a pullback of some sort. Same thing on the way down. Nothing goes straight up or straight down. It's interesting to see that movement with the dollar. And I'm wondering, with the Fed announcement coming up this week, so many people are kind of expecting or speculating that the Fed may make a, emergency rate cut. I doubt it. If you look at kind of, how the Fed behaves over time, the Fed's typically slow to react. The Fed typically wants to see confirmation of things before it does anything. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. The good thing with the Fed is, at the end of the day, they've proven that they can pretty much overcome most things with just flooding the market with cheap money. Now, is there a cost to that? Of course, inflation of some sort. But again, if you've paid any attention to what really happened a few years back with 2022, the inflation really wasn't inflation. It was corporate profits. I mean, can't have record profits for corporations. Again, not revenue, profit, but also say that, hey, we're getting squeezed because of higher supply chain costs and things like that. Nope. What was billed as inflation was really just corporations raking the consumer over the coals. Now, the second time around, I mean, with everything going on, it's really crazy. I went to Costco a couple times over the last couple weeks, mainly because for routine shopping, I mean, I typically don't go to Costco that often. But it was like, a few things I needed at different times. So I kind of had no choice but to go. And a few weeks back, I noticed it was really, really packed. Like, it's normal that Costco is busy, especially on a weekend. But there was definitely a lot of people loading up, their carts maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And what I noticed, I had to go back yesterday. What I noticed was that people were still there, but it wasn't as hectic as what it was before. I did notice, though, that it seemed like the couple weeks back when I went, things were a lot more, people were buying very specific, like, durable goods, whereas the yesterday when I went, it kind of just didn't have the same feel. Now, it was still packed, just not in the same way. And what I'm wondering is, with all the talk of, the slowdown in shipping, things like that, how this is going to play out over the short run. How do these things end up working themselves out? Because, with regard to the Fed and, what are they going to do? You figure they're not going to cut rates, because if this whole tariff thing leads to some kind of a supply shock where, certain items aren't in stock and, people have to either look for it or pay more for the same item, well, then that's inflationary, right? That causes a problem. You don't want to cut rates when the environment's uncertain like that. So I highly doubt that they're going to cut rates. And I think, the crazy part with, what people are saying is the supply shock already is going to come at some point. I mean, just the fact that there's been a slowdown in shipping from Asia here, I mean, there's got to be a price to be paid for that, right? It's not everything has, some sort of an effect to it. And from what I understand, again, the port's, obviously slower than it has been. Doesn't mean that it's, it's dead or anything. There's still ships coming in, but it's not the normal volume that you would tend to see. But also, again, the trucks, the different things like that. One of the things here in Southern California is because the port is so busy, all of the major freeways coming from that direction, obviously there's a lot of semi traffic. There's also a lot of, rail traffic coming from the port, and taking things inland. And then there's distribution centers farther inland where it gets, moved over to trucks and things like that. But you would think that, these kind of things, this whole situation is going to have some type of an effect. Now, with regard to the stock market, seeing the big drop again, any type of big drop like that in the stock market, when it happens that quickly, typically it goes oversold and then has some sort of a bounce back. That's completely normal. It really doesn't matter what the catalyst is. Now, time frames do matter, because if it's something that's, arbitrary, like the trade war really is arbitrary, it can change, meaning that it can change at any time, depending on what side of the bed Trump wakes up on, or who he listens to any particular day. And that's what happened, right? They, for the second time, they caved on, holding the tariffs. But that being said, the stock market, if you look at the bounce back up, lot of lower volume, particularly as it got closer to like the 50% mark, and on, as far as the retracement. It's pretty crazy because, again, the market, I think the crazy part for the market is like that people forget, it's made to make the most people look foolish. And so whether it's going down big and, you start to buy in or buy, puts or things like that to take advantage of the volatility downward, or if it's going up big and you get on the train late, both sides, they're making money. So it doesn't matter which direction. People think like, oh, well, they're losing money. Yeah, yes and no. They can make money in either direction. It doesn't matter. Now, the holdings that they hold long term, of course, those are going to fluctuate in value, but they can make money either way. Make no mistake. I do think it's kind of, when you start to think about these things in the grand scheme of things, like how do these things, play out over time, or how do these things work? It's kind of sad, because if you think about the market, like, people buying and selling stocks, right? Let's say, you think of it in the context of a person who, trades stocks and buys and sells, that kind of thing. But then you think of the person who really doesn't do any trading. They don't, they don't sell anything. They don't do anything like that. They purely just, invest for retirement through their 401k or things like that. Basically, the trader is using that mechanism, that known demand that, you're going to contribute through your paycheck every 2 weeks or whatever it is, and using that known to be able to make money off of, where the investments go up and down. What I mean by that is, like, let's say, for example, there was no such thing as retirement savings. Let's say, people weren't putting money away every 2 weeks. Well, obviously the market would be a very different place. It'd basically be a casino. But because that there's going to be that constant demand, well, I mean, a smart individual can take advantage of that, right? They know that there's some stability to the market in that people are dollar cost averaging every week through their paycheck. So in other words, there's always demand for investments. Now, the crazy thing is, like, this environment that we're in, where there's so many different variables, and again, some of them are arbitrary, it really does create a big risk over time. Like, what does the short-term future hold? We don't know, right? I mean, that's kind of the nature of the beast. You don't know what the market's going to do at any one time. But the fact that your situation, people think about like investments and they think about them, oh, it's for the long term. It is. But again, even with your own portfolio, whether that's gold, silver, stocks, whatever it is, I mean, you still have to relate things to your time frame, right? You can't, if you're retiring tomorrow, you can't have it all in, tech stocks, because, if the market has a bad month or a bad year and it drops 40%, well, guess what? If you start eating into that money in the year that happens, well, that money's not going to last. Sequence of returns. So these kind of things, I mean, I think about the world that we're in, everything going on. And it's funny too that I ask myself, like, hey, it's funny. I was sitting there thinking the other day about just, how things work and, different people and how they see things. And I was asking myself, like, it's funny because even myself, I realized that I'm also guilty of this. Because like when we go to work, right, we're surrounded typically with people who are in our same situation, or at least similar circumstances, right? Your colleagues, that kind of thing. And you don't really think about the other, the majority of people out there who, have completely different situations. And I think about it and I'm like, wow, like myself, I'm actually pretty fortunate, luckily, knock on wood. But there's so many people that aren't. And yet my life is so dependent on their work. For example, you go to the grocery store. Well, great. All the groceries in there, the people who take care of the store, the people who had to grow it, the people who had to pick it, the people who had to, transport it. All of these people, contributed all down the line so that I can, walk in somewhere at any time and get what I need, without even thinking about it. Aside from the money, I depend on them to make my life convenient. If the situation changed where those people weren't there, well, then I'm screwed, regardless of how much money I have. But it's interesting because I think that's lost on so many people. They think, and I think this could be part of, growing up in America, being an American. You grow up with this entitled, view of things that, hey, I should be able to go to the grocery store and get what I want. I should be able to pull into the gas station. They have gas, whatever it is. Like we don't grow up with that uncertainty of having to worry about, those kind of things not being there. So it's really crazy to me to think about this situation. And like, people say, for example, the tariffs, like, oh, what's the big deal? Da, da, da. Well, great. China has to suffer, whatever it is. Okay. I mean, I could see why some people think that, but again, like you don't realize all the people that's going to affect, all the people that's going to hurt, that can't afford to see that kind of thing. Whereas me, myself, yeah, you can inconvenience me, but at the end of the day, I have luckily the disposable income, knock on wood, to be able to hopefully overcome most of that. If there's a supply crunch, I have the money to be able to afford to outbid those who do not have the disposable income. But it's a crazy thing to think about, all of these people that we depend on every day that do things, and I took it a step further. I was just thinking like, wow, like the other part of that, like as far as looking at other people and thinking about other people is, again, you assume they have, like, again, at a surface level, I'm not saying like across the board, but you kind of assume, that they have access to the same things you do. They can, have the same experiences you do, all those different things. And then, again, like, and you think of that like on an everyday basis and you don't realize the struggle that they have. But also, like, I think about like intellectually, like when you think of people, you kind of think of everyone has a certain basic level of understanding of like how things work and, things like that. And I sat there thinking about it and I was like, it's not true. It's not true. And I think, it's funny because like, you ask people questions and they're so surface level understanding of certain things, like, economics or things like that. It's like they have no concept of how these things really work, but yet they're very ingrained and defensive of like, oh, well, no, this, that, or the other thing. It's like you can't see past, just your bias of, what, again, and it's not anything political. It's both sides do it. But, that there's real world consequences of all this stuff that you can't even fathom, that are just so far beyond your grasp. But also, like I said, like everything has consequences, everything has effects. And you can't, even if, let's say, for example, on the core issue, you were correct. Like, let's say tariffs are good or bad or whatever. Again, tariffs may be good, but the effects, the effects of that, may not all be good. And understanding those effects is important. It's crazy. It was really crazy. It was kind of like one of those eye-opening moments where I was sitting there thinking, like, even people who are intellectually challenged or maybe have disabilities and stuff like that, it's like you don't think of, how is this gonna, well, what if they depend on stuff from China? What if they, they need certain products that just to live and different things like that. Like they may not have the ability to get those things. Like it's just crazy. It's crazy to think of the fallout from this kind of stuff. And what I'm thinking about right now is just in the short run, like, have we even felt the effects yet? I don't think so. I don't think we've really felt anything. And of course, it's easy to spout off when you haven't felt the effects. But once you start to feel the effects, that's when people start realizing, maybe there's more to this than I thought. And I think that's kind of, as they say, F around and find out. I think that's kind of where we're headed, for better or for worse. And unfortunately, it's going to be all of us. Again, terror strategy and that kind of stuff there may be benefits there if used properly, but I just don't think that we've gone about it the right way. And I think we may be the ones who end up paying the price.